Jamal, it's so great to be here with you to talk about some of the trends for 2022. First, what do you see in terms of digital assets for 2022?
Well, I think that what we're going to see, what we're already seeing now, is a maturing of the virtual asset industry, particularly on the regulatory side, both in terms of their ability to comply with regulations and the ability of regulators to regulate them. I think we're going to see more of that down the road, and that's something that industry needs to be taking into consideration. There are going to be greater expectations on industry and greater expectations on regulators to begin to get this right with respect to virtual assets.
That's really interesting. Let's drill down a little bit on one fintech provider in particular, and that's with respect to fintechs that provide payment services. We've talked a lot about payments and how they're changing. What do you see in terms of fintechs that are doing payments in the coming year?
Well, this has happened before, and it continues to happen now in terms of a blurring of the line between those that are providing services to those who are providing financial services, and those service providers that actually end up providing financial services themselves. So there's a lot of confusion out there right now in terms of who actually is a payment processor and how should they be regulated. In the United States, we have some exemptions in terms of regulatory coverage on the AML side with respect to payment service providers, but you have to look at those exemptions really carefully and see that they don't apply just because somebody describes themselves as a payment service provider. You have to look at precisely what they're doing, who they're interacting with, and the bottom line is, to the extent that they are acting in a space where there is not appropriate regulatory coverage or transparency, a regulator is going to look at that and is going to want to impose that kind of regulation.
Do you see this extending into any new industries? Like gaming, I know that Microsoft just bought Activision Blizzard. Do you think that gaming might become a payment service provider in the future?
Gaming is a really good example of a migration of activities. The same way we had social media companies with their draw and their development of clients and people essentially soaking it all in, and then them using that type of data to provide other services, including financial services, you're going to see the same thing happening in the gaming context. These gaming providers are drawing people in and drawing money in like crazy. You're going to see regulators focusing on it, and my prediction is that there's going to be more discussion of direct regulation of the gaming industry. Not just gambling, but the casual gaming that we see, that everybody is addicted to on their smartphones now.
I think Metaverse is probably one of the buzzwords that certainly came out of 2021 and we're going to be expecting in 2022. When you think of the Metaverse and payments in the Metaverse, how do you foresee that being regulated, and do you see any steps being taken in the coming year?
I think that there's going to be a lot of discussion of this. I mean, you can see the Metaverse as really its own jurisdiction. Does that mean that it's going to have its own laws? It's going to have its own boundaries? Are people going to pay for a Metaverse hotel, within a Metaverse legal structure? Maybe, maybe not. And my only prediction on that front is there's definitely going to be a lot of discussion while all of these things rapidly develop.
I think I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about regulatory enforcement trends at FinCEN, where you, of course, worked for so many years. So if you can maybe give us some predictions in terms of what's going to happen in terms of regulatory enforcement trends for FinCEN in the coming year, that would be great.
It's going to be a matter of priorities. And right now, over the past year, given the explosion in ransomware attacks and the huge drain on an economy, and everybody is suffering from this, and the fact that it's actually growing, you're going to see some activity on FinCEN's part in coordination with other parts of government to try to rein this in. You can look at FinCEN's reports, you can look at OFAC's guidance. you can see that the stage is being set for more regulatory action. And another thing that helps in this context is the ability of tech service providers to provide more tools to be able to track asset flow within the crypto sphere. That's definitely going to have an impact. And I think that we'll see government actors being able to separate those digital currency exchanges that may be turning a blind eye to some very bad activity flowing through them, and those that are actually trying to comply. Look for enforcement actions to help government make those distinctions and send appropriate messages to industry.
Jamal, do you see any new rulemaking coming out, either through statutes or through regulation in the coming year?
In terms of statutes, there's a lot going on the Hill in terms of legislative ideas and many proposals. Different congressional actors, different committees discussing different things, often backed by different parts of industry with respect to those ideas. You see a certain amount of that playing out in terms of the traditional financial sector, the data sector, the tech sector, all spending money on their lobbying efforts. But in that environment, I don't know that we're going to see some sweeping legislation pass anytime soon. It's pretty complicated to put that together. But they are going to be focused on it, and what they are going to be able to do is have congressional hearings in which they are looking at the issue and particularly looking at the existing regulators and how they might be using existing rules. Are these regulators coordinating with one another? Are they coordinating with law enforcement? Look for congressional hearings where there'll be some pressure on regulators in terms of how they use existing rules. That's going to happen in the absence of passing any legislation.
Jamal, I saw that Acting Director Him Dawes in his latest speech spoke about Section 311 of the Patriot Act. Now, traditionally, FinCEN hasn't made that many designations under Section 311. Do you see any changes in 2022?
Yes. They're definitely gearing up to use that authority more. FinCEN has created a separate division, the Global Investigations Division, that is earmarked to use that authority more. The fact that the acting director recently spoke about it is telling. You know, we see a lot of focus on the digital asset space, ransomware. 311 as an authority to identify a primary money laundering concern and to take an action to kind of cut it off from the US financial system can be a very potent tool when we're talking about the digital asset space. I think that they'll be looking at it for a variety of things, but look to see some kind of action under 311 with respect to particularly concerning money laundering issues. Look to see it potentially with respect to corruption or environmental crime. That's what 311 is for, and everybody expects them to be using it more.
That was so wonderful, Jamal. Thank you for joining me today, and it's going to be a very interesting year ahead.